In the last video I made the roof of the shed, and in this one I need to make a door, seal up the windows and do some final finishing touches. This is the door opening as it is currently. You can see I've fitted the shiplap cladding flush with the door frame on both the right and the left side. At the top the frame is exposed, so my door will be able to close onto that, and at the bottom there's also part of the frame for the door to close onto, as well as the floor joist below it, and I want my door to finish level with the bottom of the shiplap here. So I took some measurements for the opening, and then I went looking at the pile of leftover shiplap cladding. I should have more than enough here to make a door, but I wanted to make sure that I used the straightest lengths, as some of them had developed a bit of a warp or twist, so I'm sighting down the lengths to pull out the most straight ones to use. And then I can cut some lengths that I can use for what will be the height of the door, and I'm cutting these oversized at the moment. I'll cut the door to its final length later on. I'll use these freshly cut ends at the top of the door where moisture ingress is likely to be less of an issue, so that I can have the uncut ends that will have soaked up a lot of that tantalizing treatment at the bottom of the door. I set up a work area inside the shed because it had helped me to have a nice flat work area to reference from, and also if it rains again, I don't get wet. I offer up a framing square so I can make sure that the bottom of the door is square. And then using the table saw I rip down some of the cladding to remove the tongue and groove parts. I can use these as battens for the back of the door to hold it all together. So I want this door to be really nice and rigid, so I am going to use some wood glue, but I do need to allow the wood to expand and contract. So what I'm going to do is run a bead of glue vertically along these slats before adding the screws, and that will lock everything in together tight. That's going to make the door nice and rigid, but it's also going to allow each piece of wood to expand and contract with seasonal moisture changes. I'm going to add 2 screws here, and I'm not too worried about these battens expanding and contracting because these are less wide, so I don't think it's going to be an issue using 2 screws here instead of just 1. I do the same again at the top of the door, and I also add one in the middle too. Then I can cut some angled braces, and I need to cut the ends of these at 45 degrees, so I used my speed square to guide the cut. And then I can offer it up to mark it for length before making the next cut. These diagonal braces get screwed in the same way with a bead of glue and screws, one between the top and centre rail and one between the bottom and centre rail. These diagonal braces should stop the door from sagging over time, and it's important to get them positioned correctly in relation to the hinges. This face of the door is the inside face, and this side is where my hinges will be, and that means that my diagonal braces will be under compression as gravity pulls the door down over time. If my hinges were on the opposite side, the braces would be much less effective and the door would start to sag over time. Sorry to interrupt the video, but I need to ask a question. Would you be interested in downloading plans and a cut list for this 12 by 8 foot shed project? If you could let me know in the comment section below, I'd really appreciate it. I'm trying to get an idea of whether it would be worth my time to create the plans or not, and the whole process of making the plans is pretty time consuming. So if there's a lot of interest, then I'll do it. If not, then I won't bother. Thank you, and back to the video. Now, measuring from the bottom, I can mark up where to cut the door to its final length, and I can use the track saw for that. And it also needed a little bit trimmed off the width of the door. I've got some of these 375mm T hinges, which I want to add where the battens are on the back of the door. That just gives more material for the screws to bite into. I drill pilot holes, and then I can add some screws, and I'm using a mixture of screws here. Some stainless steel Torx head screws, which I'm using because they'll be fine for outdoor use when exposed to the weather. And some of these galvanized one-way security screws which cannot be unscrewed, so that means anyone trying to break into the shed armed with a screwdriver isn't going to be able to get in. The only reason I'm using 2 types of screw here is because I'm making use of what I already had. Fitting the door is then just a case of offering it up, and off camera I'm holding it at the right height by wedging my foot underneath it, and then I screw in the hinges through the shiplap cladding and into the door frame behind it. And finally I can just make final refinements to the width of the door by marking up how much I want to remove and then using my electric planer. And I'm aiming for about a 2 to 3 millimeter gap here around the door. So here's an unexpected problem. It's not the end of the world actually, but I'll show you anyway. The door scrapes on the floor as it gets to there. There's a big hump in the ground there, and to be honest, I was kind of thinking that this area would be best paved anyway, because we get a lot of thoroughfare. You can see the grass is all worn away there. Plus I've got all of those old paving slabs that came from where the greenhouse used to be, so I can reuse those. One other thing to mention, I am going to pick up another pair of hinges so that I can add one right there in the center. I don't think the weight of the door actually needs a third hinge because it's quite a light door, but I think it would look better with 3 hinges, and also it'll make the door more secure. And later on I added a door stop batten to the inside of the door frame for the door to close onto. I fitted a regular door bolt to the door right where the centre batten is on the inside of the door, again so there's more material for the screws to grip into, and again I'm using a combination of those stainless steel Torx screws and security screws here. And I also drilled some 6mm pilot holes because I managed to find some of these bolts which have a square bit inside the head. I don't know what these are called, but these are also a good security feature because I can secure them on the inside of the frame with some nuts and washers, and no one is going to be able to remove these from the outside. Obviously I also bought a padlock for the door so that I can lock it. Next I turned my attention to the windows. I wanted to add some more cladding to make them look more finished and also seal the windows to make them watertight. I started with a top piece of cladding, and then I ripped down some pieces from small offcuts to trim around the windows. These smaller trim pieces were quite thin and I didn't want to use the nailer here as I think it'd split the wood, so I drilled some pilot holes and then hammered in some galvanised nails by hand. For the bottom of the windows I wanted to create an angled windowsill with a drip edge to shed the rain, and I did that by placing a small piece of the cladding at the back and then adding a part ripped from the tongue side of the cladding on top. At the time this felt like a bit of a makeshift solution, but actually I quite like the way it ended up looking. And then I used some clear silicone sealant to seal the windows in, just to stop any rain from potentially getting into the shed. I used masking tape just to get a neat finish. I decided to use some of the final long lengths of shiplap to make soffit boards to close up the gaps between the roof joists. These were not easy to fit. Getting the tongue into the groove when the cladding pieces were upside down was even worse here than it was when cladding the walls, but it seemed like a good way to use up the last few bits, and also I quite liked the way it ended up looking. Unfortunately I didn't have quite enough left to make soffits for the sides of the roof though, which was a shame, but I did have some thin strips of marine plywood, so I used those. And I fitted these bits with screws, and once fitted I made some cuts using my oscillating tool because I want to add a couple of vents, one on each of the short walls of the shed. These are called hit and miss vents I think, and I'm using these because I already had them. They're actually meant for interior use, but I can always replace these with something else if they eventually fail. These will allow ventilation and good airflow through the shed, but hopefully stop any bugs, birds or spiders getting in. I got loads of comments on one of my previous videos about rats and mice living underneath the shed, and I had always planned to fit some of this rodent-proof mesh around the bottom. I just had to wait a few days for it to arrive before I could fit it. This will allow for good ventilation underneath the shed, which is really important, and it'll hopefully stop the mice and rats getting in too. I buried some blocks into the ground and made a platform for our water butts to sit on, and I bought a joining kit too so that when one of them fills it decants into the next one. And then I added guttering along the back wall to capture all of the rainfall from the roof so that we can use it to water the garden in the summer months. Without this guttering, all of the rain would drip down onto the back wall, and I remember that being an issue when I built my first shed 5 years ago, although the reason that was more of a problem then was that I didn't use tannalized timber for the frame of that shed, which is something that I later regretted. I quite enjoy working with guttering and downpipe. It's as easy as just cutting bits to length and pushing it all together. And the final job was probably my least favourite of the whole project, which was dealing with that hump in the ground to allow the door to open properly. After digging out the turf and levelling the ground, I spread out a dry mix of 4 parts sand and 1 part cement, levelled it as best I could and added the slabs. Not a job I'm very good at. There was a lot of trial and error getting the slabs level with each other, and now I'm just glad it's done. So that's the shed finished externally, at least. In the next video in the series, I'll be doing some work to the shed internally, including making a bench, putting some shelves up, that kind of stuff. And I'll give you a bit of a tour of the inside of the shed too. I'll also go through the total costs of the project, the time scales, what I'd do differently if I were to do the project again, and I'll talk about some of the questions and comments that have been asked in the comments section since the start of this project. As soon as that's ready, you'll find a link to it in the description box below, or you can get early access to it via my Patreon page, link to that in the description box too, where you can also get free project plans and cut lists, some exclusive content, and a name credit at the end of my videos. Thank you for watching.